Just so the light's not.
Good idea.
That looks better.
It all started in 1902 when Cuba became an independent nation. How did this happen? Was there a glorious rebellion? A revolution? No. It was the United States who rode in brandishing the banner of liberty. The victory over Spain led Cuba to its independence. With Cuba under its wing, the U.S. intervened militarily 3 times between 1906 and 1921 to keep up the established democracy. Unfortunately, when the amendment that allotted aid to Cuba was repealed in 1934, the U.S. had to look on unhappily as Cuban democracy fell. Which brings me to my topic today. Cuba and the U.S. have faced difficulties coming to peace in the past, and are still somewhat at odds given the renewed interest economically in Cuba. However, this could change dramatically in the future. The 3 points I'll be going over are the political, culture, and political history that put us at odds, the U.S. being unhappy with human rights violations in Cuba, and the current policies and political attitudes that are varying. To start with the political culture and political history that put us at odds, I'll cover the lack of democracy in Cuba, the missile crisis and Soviet Union alliance, as well as the embargo and trade sanctions. The lack of democratic government in Cuba. Cuba was dominated by dictator after dictator. This fueled Fidel Castro as he promised his supporters that he would return Cuba to a democratic constitutional rule. In 1959, he overthrew the dictatorship. However, he did not fulfill his promise. Castro instead consolidated his rule, repressed dissent, and imprisoned or executed thousands of his opponents. Today, Cuba still has a totalitarian government and communistic policies. The missile crisis and Soviet Union alliance. Castro did what he could to increase relations with the Soviet Union, in turn pushing the United States away. During the cementation of Cuba's new friendship with the Soviet Union, Castro allowed them to build missile launching sites on the north shore of Cuba, just 90 miles south of the United States. This act almost brought the world into a nuclear war, and thus began the harsh Cuban economic policies we are all familiar with. Which brings me to the Cuban embargo and other U.S. sanctions on Cuba. The Cuban embargo is what we are most familiar with. However, there were other policies. Cuba was declared an aid to terrorists, which meant that there was a heavy fine on any goods traded between Cuba and allies of the U.S. While Castro has passed universal health care in Cuba and provided free education through college, most Cubans have sunken into poverty due to the unproductive economy. Castro blames America for the great poverty within Cuba, as well as his failure to be a powerful player in the international marketplace. My second point is that the U.S. is unhappy with human rights violations in Cuba, under which I will cover the lack of freedom of speech, the yearly increase in imprisonment and harassment, and Alan Gross. The lack of freedom of speech. Cuba is infamous for having a limited press. Anyone who speaks out against their government is imprisoned or executed. The only source of information is provided from their government and Castro himself. The U.S. has done what they can to promote TV and radio sources that encourage democracy in Cuba, much to Castro's outrage. Another example of human rights violations is the yearly increase in imprisonment and harassment. Cuba is notorious for being careless with human rights. They often detain political prisoners, and in 2012, they increased their short-term detentions as well as their harassment of individuals. A specific example of this is Alan Gross. The U.S. is particularly angry about the detainment of this man. He was arrested in 2009 for working on U.S. communication program. In 2011, the Cuban officials sentenced him to 15 years imprisonment. My third point is the varying current policies and political attitudes. I'll go over the official stance, the attitudes of Congress and House, and Obama's fear to disagree with opposition. The official stance. The official U.S. stance is to stay strong on our economic sanctions until human rights conditions improve. This policy stands although there is renewed interest in Cuban trade. House and Congress have presented a variety of bills to increase funding to programs that promote democracy in Cuba. Differing opinions have made it impossible for any bill to be passed, though. Given that, I'll move on to the attitudes of Congress and the House of Representatives. Many in the House and Congress refuse to make a move first without an act of goodwill. Some demand the release of Alan Gross before the embargo could even be considered to be lifted. While you would expect Republicans to oppose this issue, it actually has a great deal of bipartisan support. A group of almost 90 Democrats, headed up by Cuban-American Democratic Senator Bob Mendez, backs the continuance of the embargo. Because of this division, we can see the reason for President Obama's apprehensiveness to disagree with the opposition. Obama stalled any change on Cuban policy in February. While he has spoken out about the issue in the past and even shook hands with Raul Castro in South Africa after Nelson Mandela's funeral, he refuses to confront the intense opposition from Republicans or alienate Democrats who lobby for Cuban exile. Now let's look back at my topic today. Cuba and the U.S. have faced difficulties coming to peace in the past and are still somewhat at odds. Given the renewed interest economically in Cuba, this could change in the future. Which brings me back to my 3 points. Our political and culture that put us at odds, the U.S. being unhappy with human rights violations in Cuba, and the varying current policies and political attitudes at play. So, as I previously stated, Cuba was once our enemy, and now could be an opportunity in the world market. Whether or not we embrace the Cuban market into our trade route is up in the air. But the history remains and will remain to tell the tale of the United States and Cuba's relations. Thank you.
That was good, baby.